Welcome to the third and final lecture for the 2025 Rosenbach series. My name's Lynne Farrington, and as Director of Programs in the Kislak Center, I oversee the series as well as chair the Rosenbach Advisory Committee, which I would like to thank again for their work. And the people on the committee include Peter Diamond, who's with us tonight, Jesse Erickson, Devin Patel, Sean Quimby, Megan Robb, Joshua Teplitsky, and Whitney Tretien. In addition, I want to thank Glenda Goodman, who stepped off the committee this year, but was involved in bringing Kelly Wisecup to Penn. I'd also like to thank Gabby Franks in the back, who's been working on the tech, for running Zoom these past 3 nights, and Peter Diamond for conveying the questions of our Zoom participants to our speakers. We couldn't do it without their assistance. So let's give them a round of applause. As we heard on Monday, the 2026 Rosenbach Fellow is Joan Judge, Professor of History in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies at York University in Toronto. Professor Judge is a cultural historian of modern China with a scholarly focus on knowledge cultures, print culture, and women's history at the turn of the 20th century. We very much look forward to having her join us next year. I would also like to announce that tomorrow's From the Kislak Stacks presentation will be given by Emily Leichner, postdoctoral fellow at the American Philosophical Society, who is spending the year at Kislak Center exploring what she will be talking about tomorrow, namely Indigenous Voices in the Archives, surveying Native collections in the Kislak Center. It's on Zoom, and I'll put the link to register in the chat in case you're interested. It's been wonderful having Kelly here all week. Yesterday's informal seminar with collection materials was a real treat for those of us who were there. A chance to learn more about Indigenous print culture and think about how Penn's own collections, which came to us from many different sources, whether through purchase or gift, can work together to tell a more complete story that highlights relationships that might otherwise be obscure or hidden. We concluded with a discussion of how we should catalog Indigenous materials to make them more easily accessible to students, faculty, and researchers. Thank you, Kelly, for thinking together with us about our collections. Now to introduce my colleague, John Pollack, who will introduce this year's Rosenbach Fellow. John is Senior Curator, Research Services up here in the Kislak Center, where he has long played an important role around teaching with the collections, working closely with faculty and students both in and outside the classroom. John himself is a scholar of Indigenous Studies and Colonialism and holds a PhD in English from Penn with his 2014 dissertation on Native American Words, Early American Text. He more recently translated Roger Chartier's work, published in 2022 by Penn Press under the title One in Translation, Textual Mobilities in Early Modern Europe. He teaches an undergraduate course on the history of book in America with Jim Green, emeritus librarian at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And this spring is teaching another undergraduate course on books and revolution with Roger Chartier, with whom he also teaches rare book school courses. As if that isn't enough, he serves as a co-convener of the weekly workshop in the history of material texts, which take place every Monday during the academic year in this space. Finally, his current exhibition, co-curated with Jim Duffin, Assistant University Archivist, returns to the theme of revolution. Revolution at Penn, ? Is currently on display through early July in the Goldstein Gallery up here in the Kislak Center. It returns to some of the work John did in conjunction with another exhibition and catalog around education in the age of Franklin, which was part of the Benjamin Franklin Tercentenary. I highly recommend a trip to the Kislak Center to see the exhibition and experience the recreation of a colonial-era coffee house just outside the gallery. Now I'd like to hand the podium over to John, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Lynn. No, it's not about me tonight. I just like to hang out with Rosenbach lecturers, Jim Green and Roger Chartier, both former Rosenbach fellows. And it's one of the great pleasures of my work here, being able to work with folks like that, including tonight's Rosenbach fellow, Kelly Wisecup of Northwestern University. So welcome everybody online and in person. I'll just remind you, and you can see it on your screen, the overall title of Kelly's lectures this week is Indigenous Ecologies of the Page, Bibliography, Birchbark, and Remediation. And the title of tonight's talk is Bibliographical Pasts and Futures, Periodical Cultures, Industrial Papermaking, and Birchbark Remediations. Just to echo Lynn for a second, it's really been an honor and a pleasure to have Kelly with us for this entire week. Her wide-ranging scholarship stretches from colonial Virginia accounts to 18th century New England to 19th century indigenous collections and the assembled books, that's her phrase, accounts, extracts, lists, scrapbooks, and collections that she focuses on in the award-winning 2021 study called Assembled for Use, Indigenous Compilation and the Archives of Early Native American Literatures. In her first lecture this week, Kelly presented a wide view of Indigenous book history and then posed a series of provocative questions which inform her entire project. How might bibliography and book history attend more closely to the page as a material form? How did Indigenous writers develop what she called a political ecology of the page? Her exploration of those questions took us from Cherokee writings of the 19th century all the way to 21st century First Nations poetry. In her second lecture on Tuesday, Kelly narrowed our attention to a particular form of inscription with a long history, writing on birchbark. She explored with us a remarkable set of birchbark printed books produced by Simon Pokagon around the Columbian Exposition of 1893. These deceptively simple books, ostensibly created as souvenirs, where she showed us profoundly engaged works of this political ecology, to use her phrase, subtly deploying nostalgia, anger, and activism. Now, I thought I might highlight very briefly Kelly's innovative work, not only as a reader, but as what we might call a rereader. So I'll go back just a little bit further in time because I think we can see this on display in her first monograph, which is called Medical Encounters, Knowledge and Identity in Early American Literatures from 2013. Kelly begins Medical Encounters with Thomas Harriot's famous 1588 Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia. In a provocative passage from that text, Thomas Harriot claims that the Roanoke Algonquians believed they were dying of disease caused by the invisible bullets shot by English spirits. But rather than interpreting this as an expression of English colonial power, Kelly suggests instead that we need to understand the possible link of this assertion by Harriot with indigenous medical authority and the mediation of that authority by Harriot himself. In 2014, Kelly published an edition of Edward Winslow's 1624 pamphlet called Good News from New England, or A True Relation of Things Very Remarkable at the Plantation of Plymouth. Now, speaking as a member of a university in the United States right now, I'd say we could really use some good news from Philadelphia. But Winslow's 1624 text was a very particular kind of good news for English separatist pilgrim leaders, and the arrival of colonists was most certainly not good news for the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands. Kelly's extended introduction to Winslow's account rereads early native New England history through, around, and against Winslow. This most canonical of pilgrim writings is, she shows, a kind of distorted window through which we can glimpse native lives and indigenous polities, as well as colonial fears and fictions. Now, these works are not strictly speaking studies in book history, but they both represent new and important rereadings of familiar sources for historians of America. You can, I think, get a sense of Kelly's project of expanding the borders of early American literature to connect with transatlantic and hemispheric histories, the history of science and medicine, imperial histories, histories of enslavement and abolition, and other disciplines. As a leading voice in the Society of Early Americanists, Kelly and her SEA colleagues continue to push the field in all of these and other directions. This week has been a similar kind of exercise, I think, in rereading. As Lynn mentioned, yesterday Kelly gave a group of us an impressive review of Native American literature in Kislak Center holdings, from the Wampanoag Bible translations of the 17th century to the work of indigenous writers of the 19th and early 20th centuries, like Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins and Zitkala Shah. In doing so, though, she nudged us to push against the borders of book history. What is a book? It is paper, but also birchbark, leather work, but also quill work. What is book history for, and for whom? We are in this library space, of course, but we've seen that her study takes us far beyond the library to environmental history, to local archives, and to indigenous communities with their own living traditions of bookmaking and with powerful stories to share about the meanings of texts, oral and written, printed and manuscript. On Monday, Kelly began by citing D.F. Mackenzie's important essay, Oral Culture, Literacy, and Print in Early New England, a foundational effort to link what we might now call book history and indigenous studies. Mackenzie's eloquent text reminds us that literacy, print, and books are never neutral, but always linked to power and politics. It's a call to our field that Kelly is pursuing this week with wonderful openness, inquisitiveness, and engagement. So we're looking forward to this third lecture and to more new destinations. Thank you, Kelly, for being with us this week and for your work.
Thank you, John and Lynn, for those amazing introductions. I want to start by acknowledging that we're on the homelands of the Lenape peoples. And I also want to acknowledge that Northwestern is on the homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa, and also the homelands of the Miami, Menominee, and Ho-Chunk. I want to start tonight's talk with a set of thank yous. First is to some colleagues at Northwestern who read tonight's talk or talked with me about histories of deforestation, the environmental humanities, and industrial romances. So those people are Sarah Dimmick, Justin Mann, and Adam Syvertson. I want to also say a huge thank you to Penn Libraries and Penn librarians. It is always a pleasure to learn from librarians, and this week has really been no exception. I especially appreciated the session yesterday at the seminar, and then the time in the museum libraries yesterday with Deb Stewart. It was also really wonderful to meet Emily Leichner and learn about your work at the Kislak, which I'm excited to learn more about. Also, I know you're not a librarian, Peter, but it was wonderful to meet you this week, and thank you so much for all of your support for the talks and conversation about early America. I think my biggest thanks are for Lynne Farrington and John Pollack. I'm so grateful for your welcome and access to the collection, the conversations across the week. It was such a joy to be in the orbit of your energy and expertise and enthusiasm. So thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to start us off. In his graphic novel Paper Cuts, the Ho-Chunk artist Jim Terry contemplates the surprising relationships between his artwork and extraction of various kinds, from book and artifact collecting to clear-cutting forests. Terry created the book as an invited artist in residence for the Newberry Library's 2024 exhibit, Indigenous Chicago. The Newberry is renowned for its Edward E. Eyre collection of Indigenous literature, and the library opened that collection to Terry and two other artists who created new work for the exhibit. In Paper Cuts, Terry reflects on the fact that Eyre made his fortune selling lumber for use as railroad ties. Tracing the material and economic connections that bind logging, lumber, railroads, and libraries, Terry muses on his love for books alongside their reliance on deforestation and the infrastructures of dispossession. He juxtaposes a comment about loving the smell of paper with these scenes of industrial papermaking, the hills denuded of trees, the barge huffing fumes as it carries timber, the factory where the logs would be stripped of their bark and then ground or mixed with chemicals before being pressed into sheets of paper. What is it we're smelling when we stick our noses into a page and breathe in, these panels ask. The trees, cut, transported, ground down, and mixed with water? The wood treated with sulfite to reduce it to cellulose? What, Terry asks, are the extractive processes that eventually materialize in the archives and books we love? It's with some irony that he recognizes his own relationship to this scene, writing, "Your own work eats up trees." Paper Cuts traces the relationships among libraries, books, and paper on the one hand, and deforestation, railroad infrastructures, and collections of Indigenous belongings held far from their places of origin on the other. His work also poses a question about the relationships between Indigenous literatures and trees. He asks readers to consider the trees in the pages of the books that we read and study. This is a question about processes of extraction and deforestation required to make paper, about the environmental costs of a book. And as I'll show tonight, it's a question of trees in pages that's also a book historical question about the relationship between birchbark books and making and writing on wood pulp paper. So this lecture builds on the bibliography of birchbark books that I created for Tuesday's lecture. That bibliography traced the material forms from single sheet to container to cutout and codex, and the aesthetic forms from map to a narrative of events to political protest pamphlet that constitute genealogies of Indigenous birchbark bookmaking. I also linked these material and aesthetic forms to forms of belonging to land, and specifically to the ways that birchbark bookmakers Margaret Boyd and Simon Pokagon materialized Indigenous forms of belonging to their lands in and with birchbark pages and book bindings. Tonight, I examine how a host of different people grappled with the fact that paper eats up trees. I argue that birchbark bookmaking and its histories were crucial to articulating concerns about that consumption of trees for non-Indigenous peoples, as well as for birchbark bookmakers like Pokagon and Boyd. I follow several relationships among birchbark pages and wood pulp paper. I focus primarily on how people imagined the relationship between substrates made of trees and their histories of production. And I also unpack several imagined and material relationships between birchbark books and serial publication that provide insight into how people grappled with the massive numbers of trees that making newsprint required. So I'll start by examining how Simon Pokagon used his birchbark books to publish articles and periodicals. That section frames the next two on relations between birchbark and wood pulp paper. One on how birchbark was remade into a rhetorical figure and paratext that both fed and sought to allay settler anxiety about deforestation. And then I look at how paper industry narratives cite histories of birchbark pages in accounts of wood shortages. Finally, this lecture returns to the question with which I ended Tuesday's talk. What is entailed in attending to the where of book history? So on Tuesday, I asked this question to foreground place as a framework for book historical scholarship and for reading birchbark pages that index a host of place-based relationships. Tonight, I ask this question slightly differently. By considering the question of where in book history Indigenous peoples and books are. As I noted in Monday's lecture, Indigenous texts are present in some of the field's foundational works, namely D.F. Mackenzie's Bibliography and the Sociology of Texts. But those presences are often overlooked or erased, such as in scholars' focus on Mackenzie's work on English writers and printers, rather than his research on the Treaty of Waitangi and Maori texts. Asking where Indigenous books are in book history requires both looking for Indigenous peoples and books and for some of the processes through which they've been written out of book historical narratives. As I'll show tonight, Indigenous birchbark pages are both present and absent in processes of making and narrating wood pulp paper. So let me start by framing some of the interactions between birchbark books and periodical publication. So these are Pokagon's two birchbark books, which I talked about extensively on Tuesday. And these two books, The Rebuke and The Greeting, are often framed as ends in themselves, unique examples of someone bringing different bookmaking methods and histories together, combining letterpress technologies with birchbark substrates, drawing together printing and its cultural value in the West, alongside pages identified with Indigenous forms of communication. Tuesday's bibliography of birchbark forms challenged the idea that the books are exceptional. And tonight I build on that lecture by showing that if we conclude our study of birchbark pages with the booklets, we miss the ways that they acted as an engine for other forms of publication. This point is most evident in Pokagon's use of these booklets as gifts to publishers and philanthropists, as he sought a publisher and funding for his novel Queen of the Woods. So that novel was published posthumously in 1899, not actually with a major publisher as Pokagon hoped, but on the presses of the Hartford Dayspring newspaper, where the Birchbark booklets were also published. But Pokagon did publish extensively in periodicals following the circulation of the Rebuke and the Greeting at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. Between 1893 and 1898, Pokagon published 2 to 3 articles a year in metropolitan dailies like the Chicago Tribune, in literary journals like the Chautauquan, and in philanthropic periodicals like the Indian's Friend. Scholars usually consider Birchbark booklets and these periodical publications separately, and the periodical publications have rarely featured in studies of Pokagon's work. This is perhaps because scholars have seen the Birchbark books as souvenirs that traveled into settlers' hands and then were largely forgotten, or if we're lucky, donated to archives. Attics and archives have certainly functioned as stopping points in the book's circulation. And the booklets were circulating as souvenirs. As I discussed on Tuesday, the souvenir form is one of the features that helped the books to circulate so widely. But I also think it's possible that Pokagon's goal in printing on Birchbark was not just the production of Birchbark printed books, but that he was also seeking an avenue to periodical publication. So I'll just note briefly here that Pokagon's move to publish in periodicals and then to aim to publish a novel is one that a number of Indigenous writers are following in the late 19th and early 20th century. This is a path that Sarah Winnemucca, Gertrude Bonnen, or Zitkala Shaw, and Charles Eastman all follow. So if we think about why and how Indigenous people came to print, publishing in periodicals was one way to try to then publish a novel with a major publishing house. We get a deeper sense of the relationship between periodical publication and the Birchbark books in Pokagon's 1897 correspondence with Leon Cole. Cole taught at Yale and then later was in the agriculture faculty at the University of Wisconsin. Cole is interested in studying birds. He's one of the first people to start trying to band birds in order to track them and study them. And Pokagon at this time is sending articles about birds, pigeons and Potawatomi names for different birds to periodicals. So I think this is where their interests kind of align. About half a dozen letters sent from Pokagon to Cole in the early months of 1897 indicate that Pokagon is thinking about the materiality of different forms of publication, including but not limited to Birchbark books. In a March 6, 1897 letter, Pokagon enclosed an interview that he'd done that was published on the first page of the Chicago Tribune. His attention is not so much to the interview as to the large picture of him that he found unflattering. Pokagon attributed its quality to, quote, being chalked out from memory, as that is about the way newspaper reporters do things. He also asked Cole to return the paper to him or to send any references or notices of him in the papers. It matters not whether for or against, he said. On March 26, so about 2 weeks later, Pokagon sent what he described as a full-tone cut given to him by the Chautauquan, and he asked Cole to mention the Rebuke in the ornithological journal that Cole edited. If you have no objection, I would like to have you mention my bark book in your bulletin, Pokagon wrote. A month later, in April 1897, Pokagon promised to send Cole 2 forthcoming articles, one in the Forum and one in the Review of Reviews. A few weeks earlier, Pokagon had sent a manuscript to Cole, calling it a brief sketch for publication in your bulletin as requested. He apologized for not having more time to devote to it, noting that he was writing articles for, quote, leading magazines that will consume much of my time. Pokagon's request that Cole mention his bark books complements Pokagon's observation in a February letter to Cole that my books are all about gone. They will, I think, be valuable then in years to come. So Pokagon's comments to Cole illuminate how he linked materials and objects seen as rare and rooted in place, Birchbark books, with those associated with mass production and reprinting, newspapers, scientific journals, and other serials. There are 3 sets of relationships that I'd identify here. 1, Pokagon used the Birchbark books to gain access to other modes of publication. That is, he emphasized their value to frame them as unique in a world increasingly awash in cheap daily print. 2, the booklets were always intertwined with serial publication, given that they were printed on a jobbing press in a newspaper office in Hartford, Michigan. 3, across his writings, Pokagon repeatedly contrasted Birchbark's durability with that of paper, and explicitly stated that Birchbark is used by us instead of paper. This claim is one of the few I've located where an Indigenous author explicitly places Birchbark and paper pages into conversation with each other. But beyond explicit commentary, the material evidence also illuminates a host of relationships between birchbark pages and books and wood pulp paper. Take another example of an Indigenous birchbark book. Margaret Boyd's birchbark book cover acts as a binding for a book printed on paper. In Boyd's case, birchbark is not used instead of paper, but along with paper. As I argued on Tuesday, when Pokagon, Boyd, and others brought the codex and birchbark together, it had the effect of heightening the materiality of birchbark. Tonight, I return to that relationship and examine the multiple shifting relationships between wood pulp paper and birchbark pages in the early decades of the 20th century. When I focused on Tuesday on how Indigenous bookmakers in the Great Lakes used birchbark books and book bindings to protest deforestation on their lands, tonight I turn to settler responses to deforestation, a response that brought serial print, wood pulp paper, and Indigenous birchbark books into deeper and often stranger relationships. So in this next section, I extend Tuesday's lecture on the analogies that reviewers of Pokagon's birchbark books saw among birchbark pages, trees, and Indians, analogies that Pokagon and Boyd rematerialized as forms of belonging to place. In the 20th century, these analogies traveled in ways that let them do different work for non-Indigenous peoples. And I'm finding two patterns here. First, birchbark is transformed into a literary or rhetorical figure. Authors invoke birchbark in the title or description of a work to frame their text as an Indian book, quote unquote, or to align it with the qualities broadly associated with indigeneity. This is a kind of bookish version of what Philip Deloria calls playing Indian. Two, birchbark is transformed into a visual pattern that exists separately from its origin on a birch tree. This pattern might be reproduced on wood pulp paper or made into paratext, such as in birchbark pages being used for decorative bindings or end papers. So let's look at two examples of the first pattern where birchbark book is transformed into a literary figure. In this pattern, settler authors invoke birchbark materiality, the associations of its pages with forests, wilderness, and Indigenous peoples, in order to define formal or thematic features of their works. One way this works is that the word birchbark functions as a modifier in their titles. In fact, birchbark functions only in Harriet Maxwell Converse's title. There is no actual birchbark roll or page on which the legend that she relates is written. The references to a so-called birchbark legend are purely figurative. Converse's book tells the story of a Haudenosaunee woman, a conniving man from her nation as a possible love interest, an Indigenous man from a hostile nation who's the real love interest and whom she marries to connect their communities, but only after she's sent over Niagara Falls in a canoe and is rescued from the falls by her wolf. Again, birchbark is entirely figurative in this story. There are no references to historical legends inscribed on birchbark or to actual birchbark substrates. Instead, she invokes the history of inscriptions on birchbark to lend authenticity and a sense of romance to the book. For Ernest Thompson Seton, the birchbark roll in question is a set of laws or rules governing boys' clubs. The birchbark roll is a guide for forming outdoor hobbyist clubs. Seton provides instructions for young boys to go outside, form regimented clubs modeled after his vision of an Indian tribe, and to play various games or challenges. He believed that such activities would counteract the effects of industrialized urban life. Seton commented that he drew on Indian name and style, such as the different, quote, chiefs who are club officers, because they add the charms of color and romance. Seton's book features imitation birchbark end papers, elements that contribute further to the charms of color and romance by associating the book materially with what Seton calls Indian style. So what you see here are end papers for his book, all made of wood pulp paper, but the papers on the right made to look like birchbark. The visual language of birchbark allows for playing Indian at the level of the book, the end papers promising connection with all the wholesome qualities of what Seton named primitive times. As Philip Deloria has explained, one use for Indian play was to, quote, encounter the authentic amidst the anxiety of urban, industrial, and post-industrial life. And certainly Seton's birchbark roll did similar work, placing readers into connection with the so-called wilderness and an authentic primeval relationship to the forest. Seton's book is one of a number of examples of imitation birchbark end papers and book covers made in the early to mid-1900s. So here, wood pulp paper is evoking the past with the mass-produced materials of the present. Like Seaton's book, these books transform birchbark into an aesthetic element that associates the book with certain qualities understood to be associated with Indigenous peoples, forests, and wilderness. These birchbark covers and imitation end papers promise access to an indigeneity that's desirable because it's safely ensconced in figurative realms. And I'll just note one interesting piece about the two books that I have on the slide here is that Arthur Parker is Indigenous. He's Seneca. He is the nephew of Ely Parker, who I talked about on Monday, who kept the newspaper scrapbooks. So it's interesting that Indigenous peoples are also picking up these kind of figurative uses of birchbark for book covers. Finally, some books use birchbark sheets as bindings or paratexts, and while there are real sheets of birchbark here, the function for the book is purely decorative rather than functional. So this is a folio book that's printed in Seattle and copyrighted in 1910. The copy at the Newberry Library has a birchbark cover. The book is stapled on the fold, and you may be able to see, but maybe not, there's a staple underneath the cedar strip that functions as a kind of decorative binding. And a note says, that accompanies the book. This is probably the only book in existence which blanket Indians have helped to make. The cedar bark with which this book is tied having been stripped from the tall Washington giants by the Indians of Cape Flattery, the wildest and westernmost portion of the United States. So while the cover here is made of real bark, the effect is similar to Seaton's imitation birchbark end papers. It acts as a material reminder of, quote unquote, a passing race. I think we can compare these uses of birchbark to the objects like baskets, blankets, and other items that people collected for what Elizabeth Hutchinson has called Indian corners. And just to invoke Terry again, this is Edward E. Eyre, the Newberry collector, with his Indian corner. Hutchinson argues Indian corners define their owners as not native, and thus also as having none of the qualities associated with Indigenous people. Not dependent on pre-industrial tools, collectors are able to appreciate them for their aesthetic value alone. I think a similar movement is occurring with birchbark pages. These books create distance from Indigenous people's uses for and expertise with birchbark at the same time that they imitate the materials and that expertise produced. The books suggest that their value lay in their appearance and what they could invoke at the level of affect, rather than in any of the material qualities or relationships so important to Indigenous peoples' making, distribution, and commentary on birchbark books. Imitation birchbark papers had a relationship to trees located not in their materiality, their having once been part of a birch tree, but in their capacity to signal certain qualities while remediated on woodpulp paper. This paper is, of course, made of trees, and more on that in a moment, but as it is made to look like a sheet of bark, that relationship to a tree and the processes used to make the paper is obfuscated. If wilderness books like Seaton's and Abbott's use imitation birchbark paper to allow readers to place themselves into imaginative relationships with quote unquote nature, paper companies and their spokesmen sought to remake relationships with forests by urging readers to see trees in woodpulp paper. They did so in part to acknowledge the looming consequences of deforestation, an issue paper companies framed primarily as a problem of supply. This was a concern because the demand for newsprint, the mass-produced paper on which newspapers were printed, led to a demand for millions of tons of lumber each year. In expressing concern that readers didn't see trees in paper, paper company spokesmen expressed anxiety about the obfuscation of labor and raw materials that industrial supply chains made possible, and about the environmental destruction that industry was causing. So here are two examples of this kind of desire to get people to see trees in their paper. The first is from a sociologist, Robert Park, who says trees are a big facet in making possible nature's response to civilization's demand for comfort, entertainment, and luxury measured in the intellectual things of life. Have you any trees in your community? If not, why not? Where have they gone? And why were they not replaced? Forestation was one of the greatest problems before the American people today. The newspaper of today was a tree yesterday. Every forest reserve is an asset to meet future accounts. The second comes from Royal S. Kellogg, who worked for the Forest Service before going on to become the director of the American Paper and Pulp Association, and then to work at the Newsprint Service Bureau. In his newsprint paper in North America, he wrote, "Few people realize that the omnipresent sheet on which they read the daily news of the world is as truly a forest product as the chair in which they sit, the table from which they eat, or the baseball bat with which home runs are scored." As Michael Stamm has pointed out in his 2018 book, Dead Tree Media, The modern newspaper was a mass media object fueled by advertisements that allowed for larger pages, made possible by cheap paper, which in turn required massive numbers of trees. The consequences of that deforestation had been clear for decades by the time Park and Kellogg wrote. Government interventions to try to ensure a sustainable lumber supply furthered the transformation of indigenous lands into private property. So in 1873, Congress altered the Homestead Act to encourage settlers to plant trees. And they did this primarily in plain states which did not have forests. Also in 1873, the Timber Culture Act was passed, and it provided additional land to homesteaders who would plant and maintain 40 acres of trees. So whereas cutting forests had for centuries factored as a sign of civilization and settlement, now tree planting and afforestation became marks of property ownership and improvement. Planting trees now function to help transform indigenous lands into property. Indigeneity and histories of birchbark page making was central to how paper companies narrated both the problem and the possible solutions to deforestation. Paper industries used the language of colonialism and indigeneity to describe industrial papermaking. These two figures work together. First, the language of colonialism located papermaking in US imaginations as necessary for modernity and part of the story of civilizing the wilderness as they understood it. Then, Forest Service and industry authors invoked indigenous histories of the book, and specifically birchbark substrates, in an attempt to locate woodpulp papermaking within long-standing indigenous ecologies of the page. So let me take the language of colonialism first. This language appears across media, from promotional films to multi-issue newspaper stories to industry-produced pamphlets described as industrial romances. The industrial romance is a corporate genre produced by various industries in the early decades of the 20th century. It brings together detailed descriptions of logistics with elements of the romance. I want to be clear, however, industrial romances about papermaking are not novels, and they do not involve domestic or marriage plots. There is excellent scholarship on the industrial romance novel. Nathan Hensley and Philip Steer argue in a novel about Cole and Elizabeth Gaskell's 1855 novel North and South that the industrial romance novel seeks to manage new energy regimes by placing them, as they put it, in a national paradigm defined by the marriage plot and its implicit corollaries, heterosexual domesticity and reproductive futurity. So for instances of the industrial romance novel, in its manifestation as an energy-oriented marriage plot, I would point you to Gaskell's novel and also to H.G. Wells's 1895 short story, The Cone. But what I've located in promotional films, newspaper articles, and paper company archives are industrial romances that are attentive not to narratives of love and adventure, but to the supposedly mythical logistics and processes of papermaking. The romance of the paper company industrial romance is found in the genre's capacity to speculate on the future, which it embeds in the world of supply chains, forests, company towns, pulp-making processes, and transportation logistics. The romance genre here frames a future improbable. It's improbable in its marvelous efficacy, speed, or convenience, even as the industrial romance promises that the powers of industry will achieve that speculative future. Ironically, if the narrative of the industrial romance reaches its desired end of efficient production and transportation, it ends in an anti-romance future. Like the wilderness clubs that Seaton promoted, the paper company industrial romance registers settler anxiety about the costs of modernity, while seeking to foreclose and animate that future simultaneously. Across these industrial romances, the language of colonialism, the frontier, the wilderness, and so on, is used to describe forests before loggers and paper mills arrive as so-called pioneers to transform them into the materials of civilization, figured by newsprint and other kinds of paper. So let's walk through some examples. In the 1930s, the Chicago Tribune printed a 4-part industrial romance titled Trees to Tribune, the romance of newspaper making. It also produced a short film similarly entitled From Trees to Tribune, which described the process whereby the paper obtained what it called a perpetual supply of trees from a forest in Canada to which the Tribune had obtained logging rights. The film details how the trees were cut. Sorry, I'm going to go back one slide. The film details how the trees were cut, processed at a mill town the paper built in Thorold, Ontario, and then shipped through the Great Lakes to Tribune warehouses. The film uses the language of colonialism to describe logging and papermaking. It suggests that loggers and mill towns are following in the footsteps of, quote unquote, the hardy pioneers, that is the French, by bringing civilization and order to what had been, quote, an impenetrable wilderness and forest primeval. And I really recommend Stam's Dead Tree Media. It's a really great study of the Tribune's paper across Chicago and in Canada. Kellogg's 1948 newsprint paper in North America describes paper mills as pioneers, framing the mills as the vanguards of settlement and civilization. Writing of the turn to wood as the raw material out of which paper was made, Kellogg observed, now a large amount of cheap water paper was required, and at the same time, the power needed to be situated near a large supply of spruce wood. These conditions were met in northern New York and New England, and here pioneer wood pulp mills were established. The language of the wilderness, primeval forests, and pioneer pulp mills places the setting for the origins of paper making in a mythic frontier that invokes the Romance genre, even while casting logging and paper making as vanguards of civilization and modernization. Industrial romance is frequently described and defined the marvelous through scale, the numbers of trees felled and processed, the mass transportation of those trees, and then paper from one place to another on frozen roads and water, and the efficacy with which all of this happened. Take this example from a 1934 publication from the Kalamazoo Vegetable Parchment Company, The History and Story of Papermaking and Industrial Romance. The pamphlet asked readers to revel in the speed with which trees were transformed into paper. Like other accounts of papermaking, this romance put the number of logs processed at the edges of human comprehension. There is not even a highway large enough to hold all of the logs that the Kalamazoo Vegetable Parchment Company is transporting. At the same time that they celebrated the efficacy and speed with which they cleared forests and transformed trees into newspapers, paper companies also readily acknowledged that forests were not easily or quickly replaced. They do foresee the future environmental costs of papermaking. The Vegetable Parchment Company's industrial romance observed, this is the third quotation on the slide, with these figures before us, it is no wonder that there is much concern in the United States regarding the question of how long our forests will withstand this and the other commercial drains of modern civilization. The papermaking industrial romances elicit enthusiasm for the marvels of modern industry while seeking to manage fears about these commercial drains of modern civilization. One strategy for addressing this threat was to link wood pulp papermaking to histories of indigenous substrates, specifically birchbark. These accounts locate industrial wood pulp papermaking as part of longstanding traditions of making paper from trees. In an article entitled "The Wood Pulp Paper Supply Getting Short," published by the Forest Service and then reprinted with different titles across US newspapers in 1906 and 1907, the author rehearses a familiar refrain from industrial romances, observing the cheapness and availability of paper along with its environmental costs. There's never been an era like the present for cheap printed paper. And the drain upon the spruce forest is so great there may be a famine of that wood. Then, the author places these practices of making wood pulp paper in relationship to etymologies and histories of indigenous birchbark substrates. As the word paper comes from the name of a paper-making plant, so the word library has a similar derivation from the bark, liber, of trees, because books were once made on sheets of bark, just as our American Indians have put records on the paper-thin bark of the birch. Book comes from Anglo-Saxon beck or beech, since early Teutonic tribes used the bark of that tree for writing material. This turn to indigenous peoples for an ancient history of papermaking on bark is mirrored in paper company advertisements. So this is an advertisement for Tonanka Paper Company, which is now known as Badger Paper Mills in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Birch bark is invoked in the design and language of the ad. Birch logs form letters, and there's an image of a birch bark sheet on the outside cover. The inside text tells an apocryphal story about the Odawa leader Pontiac giving French people promissory notes for items that were taken in an attack of Odawa people on French people. And those promissory notes were written on birch bark. The copy reads, "His birch bark was good as gold," and frames the promissory note as the first Indian war loan. The inside copy offers an advertisement for paper that reads, "Chief Pontiac kept his friends with good paper, just as Tonanka Mimeo Bond has been doing since it was first made available to stencil duplicator users." The advertisement promotes Mimeo paper and also war bonds, and birch bark's durability lends material weight to Pontiac's promises, and in turn, these images associate qualities of durability with Tonanka paper. Moreover, the advertisement frames wood pulp paper as an American product with deep roots in the continent, like the Forest Service article that located wood pulp paper as a modern ancestor of birch bark pages. It does this by dematerializing birch bark from its relationship to birch trees. by representing it as an image on wood pulp paper and then rematerializing birchbark as part of a genealogy of wood pulp paper. Unlike the imitation birchbark end papers in books by Seton and others, here dematerialized birchbark is made to stand as an early origin for industrial wood pulp papermaking, one that potentially justifies the overuse of trees to make paper. Tanaka created a suite of promotional materials to associate its papers with Indigenous homelands. While this map, Indians of the Paper Country, represents Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes and cites historical documents at the Wisconsin Historical Society as its source, the images of Indigenous peoples are gimmicky and cartoonish. The map is a kind of land acknowledgement. It traces where Indigenous peoples were when first, quote unquote, encountered by French missionaries. And it registers Indigenous peoples' presence across Paper Country in order to describe what the map calls as that region's rich Indian heritage. It also locates that presence firmly in the past. This map's historical narrative echoes a Chicago Tribune article from 1930 that invoked the Potawatomi people on whose lands Chicago stands to narrate the transportation of newsprint from the paper's Milltown in Ontario. The article explains that the newspaper brought its first cargo of newsprint into the port of Chicago last night and docked where the Potawatomis in early days beached their canoes. The acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples' presence in early days aligns with a contemporaneous settler practice of narrating Indigenous history, including Indigenous dispossession, from what they called the Indian side of the question. Potawatomi historian Zeta Ballou has analyzed this process in settler narratives of Potawatomi removal from Indiana and Michigan, and I think her insights are relevant here. She writes, by taking the Indian side of the question and claiming that the sons of the present were not the forefathers of the past, non-Indians were settling the story of Potawatomi removal. In the process, they gave their community and their region a past that was simultaneously romantic and tragic, positioning themselves as its inheritors and interpreters. The paper company materials are not very coherent historical documents, especially compared to the settler histories that Ballou writes. But the attention to Indigenous peoples' ancestral homelands, to histories of birchbark substrates, and Indigenous histories of birchbark pages, all of this is of a piece with those settler histories interested in the Indian side of the question. And the paper company materials serve a similar function to those settler histories. They claim a romantic past for US industry while positioning paper companies as the inheritors of Indigenous practices, and even more crucially, of Indigenous peoples' relations to and uses of trees. Industrial romances and paper advertisements claimed relationships with forests at the same time that they framed those forests as uncivilized wilderness frontiers that industry would civilize and modernize. There's a celebration of industry at the same time that these materials express nostalgia for what is and will be lost as paper companies cut forests. As Tanaka's advertisements show, one strategy for disavowing this environmental destruction was to position Indigenous peoples, rather than forest ecosystems, as a lost object. This redirects the object of nostalgia away from forests and away from environmental responsibility and toward Indigenous peoples, who are then depicted as unreal, cartoonish, and otherworldly in this industrial future. At work in these representations is what Native Studies scholar and political theorist Kevin Brunel calls settler memory, a form of active forgetting that positions Indigenous peoples as simultaneously there and not there, as existing in the past and as people stuck in time, instead of as present political forces that would pose a threat to US and industry property claims. Brunel calls settler memory an unattended, productive capacity of settler colonialism that, as well as disavowing indigeneity and settler colonialism, also shields attention away from the standing interests and expressions of white settlerness. These advertisements, romances, and histories are one register of how settler memory worked in and through papermaking. And they show how papermaking documents advance the active forgetting of the relations Boyd and Pokagon spell out in their birchbark books and in their writing. The Forest Service article linking the present of papermaking to the past of Indigenous birchbark pages registers how settler memory appears casually across a range of genres and formats. Similarly, the birchbark figures in books by writers such as Maxwell, Converse, Seton, Abbott, and others contribute to the work of settler memory to disavow indigeneity by making it into a style that could associate book objects with wildness or with freedom from modernity. So why don't we turn here to consider the question of the where of Indigenous book history, to which I gestured at the beginning of this talk. The paper company, industrial romances, maps, and narratives illuminate how both Birchbark paratexts and figurations are deeply entangled with questions of land and property. Indigenous lands are present in the trees taken as raw materials for the machine of modernity, in the references to Birchbark pages in articles about deforestation, in the congressional acts that made settler property forms contingent on both clearing and planting trees. Indigenous lands are central but disavowed elements in stories of woodpulp papermaking. When papermaking histories and promotions invoke pioneers, frontiers, and wilderness, they recognize on some level that deforestation was extraction. As Matt Hooley defines it in his book, settler colonial extraction functions not just as a taking of materials as resources from indigenous lands like logging, but as the transformation of lands and the relationship with other than human beings on those lands into other forms of belonging, often described as private property. For Hooley, extraction is both a cultural and an ecological concept. This signals how both forms of colonial belonging proliferate around indigenous land possession and how those forms remake themselves through the management of ecological meaning. The papermaking advertisements, romances, and narratives represent not just the use of trees to make paper, but the imposition of colonial forms of belonging onto indigenous lands. The romances and Tanaka's racist representations of indigenous peoples divert readers from grappling with the consequences of that imposition, consequences that range from forced and violent removal and dispossession of indigenous peoples to environmental destruction. When read alongside Birchbark bookmaking, these materials also make clear how histories of the page and of paper must attend to these disavowed histories of settler colonialism. So in light of that history, what might it mean for our fields to grapple with the where of book history? By this, I mean that we might grapple with how the dispossession of indigenous lands and the paradoxical presence and absence of indigenous peoples in narratives of the field have structured not just the histories of the book, but the making of the very paper we inscribe, make impressions on, collate, and read. As I detailed on Monday, D.F. McKenzie's attention to Maori peoples' transitions from orality to literacy to print are the parts of his argument that are most loudly echoed in studies of indigenous book history and literacy. But Mackenzie's focus on the textual variants of the Treaty of Waitangi and their significance for understandings of sovereignty also lay a foundation for studying the relation between property forms and textual production that's relevant for book history writ large. The papermaking narratives I've read today suggest that these questions of property and sovereignty are relevant for many books and archives, not just those that are treaties. It's also my sense that this attention to place and property in book history could let Indigenous book history make common cause with ongoing work toward feminist, queer, Latinx, and Black bibliographies. While Indigenous book history and bibliography often works towards similar ends as these scholars in adjacent subdisciplines, the scholarship has run along parallel tracks that aren't always in conversation. So I'm interested in how Indigenous book history might support those efforts, how we might understand the active, productive forgetting of bibliographers, bookmakers, printers, and so on, who aren't white men, as interconnected. As scholars of Indigenous feminisms have shown, the dispossession and colonization of Indigenous lands, the transformation of lands into property, is deeply entangled with gendered forms of violence and white supremacy. Another way to say this is that the imposition of property forms onto Indigenous lands is deeply interconnected with and indeed produced by and sorry, let me start over. Another way to say this is that the imposition of property forms on Indigenous lands is interconnected with, productive of, and produced by structures of race, gender, and sexuality that many scholars have shown are interwoven with the production, cataloging, and circulation of books. So one through line from my lectures this week is the claim that histories of the page and paper are inextricable from questions of property forms. Those property forms are themselves deeply linked both to settler colonial dispossession and to structures of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. So one future direction for Indigenous book history might be to foreground how these different processes are related and how they've shaped the history of the field, to grapple with the multiple forms of dispossession bound up in the making and uses of paper and the codex. At the same time, these questions of property forms and dispossession in histories of the book require attending not just to obfuscations and erasures, but also to ongoing relations Indigenous sovereign nations have to their lands as the grounds for bookmaking and book histories. That is, I don't want to lose sight of the Indigenous ecologies of the page that insist on forms of belonging to place not reducible to settler property forms. To sketch out one avenue for where we can trace that insistence, I'm going to conclude this lecture by tracing a final set of relations among birchbark, woodpulp paper, and cereal production. So I glossed these objects briefly on Tuesday. They're called cutouts, and they're made of single sheets of birch bark. Anishinaabe women made and still make these cutouts to use as patterns for beadwork. Because of this use, they were often seen by early 20th century ethnographers as a kind of intermediary form, used to make another kind of object rather than valued for their status as a sheet of birch bark. However, today, many cutouts are held in museum collections or included in exhibits, and they're frequently cataloged as individual objects of art. The cutouts are in the shapes of flowers, teardrops, circles, and other designs familiar in Anishinaabe beadwork. Like the birchbark pages I discussed on Tuesday, these cutouts index trees materially in their status as birchbark. But unlike the square shape of those pages, they also index living things formally through their shapes. Around the early 20th century, Indigenous women began to make cutouts out of newsprint in addition to birchbark. The use of newsprint might seem to be a direct commentary on deforestation and the scarcity of birch trees, a register of the difficulty accessing forests on traditional homelands, given reservation boundaries and the restrictions on Indigenous peoples' mobility. And certainly, settler interpretations of scarcity are never far from birchbark. Bureau of American Ethnology anthropologist Frances Densmore argued that the cutouts should be seen as pure art forms. She suggested that this pure form, rather than trees, was endangered, writing, "Such patterns are interpretations of natural forms and may be regarded as art. The old Chippewa say that such patterns in their beadwork came after the geometric patterns and before the model floral patterns which imitate nature." She went on, "The birch trees still stand on the hillsides, but the native art of the Chippewa is gone forever." So if we put to the side these ubiquitous frameworks of scarcity through which collectors read birchbark forms, we can glimpse instead how newsprint cutouts remediate histories of birchbark substrates. They pull a birchbark form through to another medium, while registering simultaneously the relationships between woodpulp paper and deforestation. The newsprint cutouts might also register the ubiquity of periodicals in Indigenous households in the 20th century. Certainly, many Indigenous people are publishing in periodicals, and many people are reading periodicals, small local weeklies and urban dailies, in addition to tribal newspapers printed on reservations. The use of newsprint, along with birchbark for cutouts, parallels Pokagon's interest in using his birchbark books as an engine for serial publication. The cutouts establish another line of dialogue between periodical publication and materialities and birchbark. The cutouts also help us understand Indigenous uses of birchbark and newsprint pages, not as a teleological story of scarcity and replacement, but as practices layered one on top of another, not just remediating, but also interanimating each other. One place where this relationship is visible is in a 2023 painting by the Ojibwe artist Andrea Carlson. So this is Ancestor and Descendant. It is a 44 by 180-inch painting composed of 24 paper panels. Carlson has described this painting as putting ancestors and people who have passed as almost like the migas that I'm following. So by this, she means she's following these artists and makers, much like Ojibwe people followed a migas shell from the Northeast to their homelands in the Great Lakes. Carlson continues, "These are people who've gone before. My work can operate as its own material." Birchbark containers and cutouts figure as some of the ancestors in this painting, ancestors of Carlson's art practice and of contemporary Ojibwe art more generally. There are cutouts of two flowers and a butterfly, and those are on the far right image, and then also several birchbark containers with etchings on their sides, and those are the middle two images. The etchings on the containers were and are sometimes made with cutouts, so we can think about these forms as intimately related, both in their original forms and in their representation on Carlson's painting. Two containers are turned, so we see the bottom or inside of the container. We get a strong sense of their three-dimensionality. The containers and cutouts are arranged along the same plane, moving toward the center of the painting. And the objects gain in dimensionality and color as they move toward that center. Carlson describes her paintings as landscapes or seascapes that she layers and stacks. And we can see this in the way the panels build on and repeat each other as objects move toward the horizon. As Carlson says of this format, "It's my way of illustrating that land is stacked upon land. There's story upon story in a singular space." We can add to this Carlson's comments about her decision to work on paper. She writes, "If you think of how paper has been violently and historically used to displace natives through treaties, through deeds, through contracts, to abstract the land, to commodify it, paper has been used violently to disenfranchise Indigenous voices and people. So reclaiming that material, putting the landscape on that material, there is this kind of painting in the void. Similar to Carlson's painting on the very substrates used to displace Native peoples, the newsprint cutouts reclaim paper made from forests, stacking story upon story, even in a substrate whose surface, promotion, and historical narratives have been used to displace, disavow, and forget Indigenous peoples. I hope this sense of the cutouts in Carlson's print as stacked story upon story in a singular space might also return us in new ways to the place of book history. We might add to these questions of where Indigenous peoples are in book historical scholarship, a question of the page as a space that renders displacement, abstraction, and disavowal, as well as a space for reclaiming, layering, and remaking. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kelly. We could take some questions from the floor. Do we have any questions to begin with? I know Peter's checking Zoom for questions as well. And if you're on Zoom, please feel free to put your questions in. Mitch.
Thanks. I love the end part with the cutouts here too, but my question is more about something you mentioned at the very beginning in reference to the Birchbark books of Pokagon, and the one reference to Birchbark as a durable material that resists water. And I wondered, one of the things that seems also commented on about the pulp paper revolution is its flimsiness and terrible reliability, and the fact that it disappears after a certain number of years. And I wondered if commentary on the disappearing forests or, removal of populations, relates this also to like a switch to a less durable media.
That's so interesting. So one of the things that reviewers say about Pokagon's books is that, I kind of reference, I talk more about this on Tuesday, so apologies if this is a recap. Reviewers sort of see analogies between birchbark pages, trees, and Indigenous people. And this gets repeated kind of over and over in reviews of the booklets that come out in 1893. And there's just this assumption that all of these things are vanishing, right? That the page is a kind of figure for vanishing Indigenous people. And so, it's interesting that Pokagon on those same pages of that booklet say this is actually a very durable substrate, and we use it instead of paper. And he kind of makes a kind of strong claim for its longevity and its contrast with paper. So I think that paper makers and also reviewers of Pokagon are kind of not reading that as we might expect them to. And I think, in other words, they're not saying this durable substrate, durable Indigenous nations, right? They're saying we see vanishing here. Even though, of course, they are also seeing the ways that wood pulp paper does not last very long and it's not very durable. So I think I might this is a great question. I really appreciate it. And I think I would say for now that the kind of nostalgia and expectation of Indigenous vanishing has been so much a part of the narrative for over 100 years by 1893 that it seems like the pages just invoke this kind of preset of responses for a souvenir of Indigenous peoples, rather than what maybe Pokagon hoped for, which was a kind of sense of remaining and of lasting and durability. So it's interesting that there's a kind of failure to read that durability, maybe even kind of straightforwardly, that reviewers are kind of interested in these other narratives. Does that get at what you're asking? Okay, a great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. That was really an amazing talk. I'm also thinking, yeah, it's on. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
I can hear myself in the mic. I'm just thinking about your call to what indigeneity and Indigenous studies brings to book history here at the end. And one of the other things that's resonating with me that I'm kind of pulling out of your talk tonight is that, when I think in terms of scale in book history, it's often attached to tales of literacy and the expansion of literacy, and these being like wonderful things is implied in that conversation. But expansion of literacy entails resource depletion and extraction as well.
Yeah.
Like thinking about the early modern period, you're working with rags to make paper, and it's at a much smaller scale. And a lot of work's being done right now on recycling and reuse, and how much the medieval period through the early modern period substrates were an economy of reuse. And you're kind of pointing us to how industrialization, increased literacy with industrialization, leads to increased extraction in ways that these cutouts and some of the artists that you're working with are pushing back against. So not really a question, just kind of thanking you for bringing that to my attention a little bit more poignantly than I had really, and like sharply than I had thought about it before.
Well, thank you for the just the context from early modern studies, which I really appreciate, and the thinking about reuse. I'm reminded of our reuse, recycle, right? And the sense that it's the right thing to do to like reuse and recycle our paper now. So I think there's an interesting, I don't know, there's an interesting through line there perhaps. And thinking about expansion is also really interesting as a kind of thing that fields often try to do to sustain themselves and to ensure their futures, and that, you know, I think we're all invested in on some level as people who are in a university context, but also the ways that that expansion can, as you put it, lead to destruction and extraction. And so for me, what the cutouts and the Birchbark books do is sort of put a materiality to that extraction. So just to say thank you back.
Some questions from Zoom. The first question from Zoom comes from Emily Davidson. Have you looked into paper companies named after indigenous nations, such as Mohawk Paper, founded in 1931 in upstate New York, or looked into the proliferation of wood type that resemble birchbark logs, such as typefaces made by Hamilton Manufacturing Company in Two Rivers, Wisconsin? Both of these examples might extend and support the arguments you made today.
Thank you, Emily. I did not know of those examples, so really appreciate them. And I would be happy to be in conversation in the future if our work can be useful to each other. So yeah, I think that these are the kind of ways that Indigenous people get worked into the titles and the materiality of papermaking. We see that as part of the book titles that invoke birchbark as part of their title as a kind of figure. And we see it, I think, also in the kind of turn to these histories of birchbark as a way to justify birchbark bookmaking. And, you know, I find Kevin Brunel's account of settler memory a really useful way to think about things like naming industries or companies after Indigenous peoples as a way to sort of evacuate Indigenous peoples, the kind of meaning of an Indigenous nation's name from its political potency. In the Great Lakes area, Blackhawk is a name that you will see on many sports teams, businesses, et cetera. And so one thing one effect that has is that people no longer associate the name Blackhawk with the actual person who fought this anti-colonial war against the United States, but simply with a figure that kind of can be detached and moved. So I think the names for Indigenous peoples of Paper Company does similar work. And it's interesting that it's also happening like on Indigenous lands, the instance of the Mohawk Paper Company. So thank you for those examples.
The next question from Zoom comes from Peggy Woolsey. It's about this last slide. Peggy asks that the last slide shows a newsprint cutout flower and appears to be deliberately centered over the text. Could you comment on that centering?
Yeah, you know, I thought a lot about whether to try to make something of the centering, and sometimes you can read little phrases left in the cutout. And so I don't think I can make a kind of strong argument for intentionality here, except that the phrases left are often rather, I would say, ironic, or they seem like someone's having a little bit of fun with how they're choosing to cut out a piece. So, you know, this looks something like colonial days maybe, or US Army. And so, you know, it's interesting to think about Indigenous women on reservations in the early 20th century and what they're reading and what they're learning of the world, and the, you know, if this is a kind of US an article about the US military, and then how they're choosing to make something else out of that title. So I made the same observation that the question asker did, and I don't know that I have a kind of strong argument or take on it, except to say that it does seem intentional, even though it kind of varies across the cutouts that I've seen. So some don't seem intentional at all. I'll just say the Minneapolis Institute of Arts has digitized a number of their Birchbark and newsprint cutouts. So if people want to see more examples, I have the citation information for this earlier. The Minneapolis Institute of Art has a really good digitized collection of these pieces.
Thank you, Kelly, for another really interesting talk. I was struck by the way you characterized Pokagon, and I think some of the other writers as seemingly really enthusiastic participants in the kind of capitalist economy of like print production. And I'm wondering if, sort of looking across the publications, if you are able to sort of discern anything about a kind of project or about an audience that that he or others are trying to reach.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think about it kind of in relation to these larger questions of like, how did Indigenous people come into print, and what were they hoping to do with coming into print? So, so your question is about audience. So one interesting thing is that a number of people publish in children's periodicals and then go on to publish in literary periodicals and then go on to publish a novel. So that tells me something about an audience as expectations for what Indigenous print at the end of the 19th century is going to be, that it's going to be a kind of story that you're going to tell a child, as opposed to like what I think Red Man's Rebuke and many of Pokagon's periodical publications are, which are critiques of colonialism. So that's something about audience. That said, I think that the writers working at the end of the 19th century are also savvily working those print networks to think about how they can move from one publication form to another. And so, you know, Pokagon is sending copies of the Birchbark books to people at editors at major publishing houses. I think trying to use them as inroads into publication. So I think, you know, one thing I've learned from doing this work is not to base my interpretation on one piece, but to try to look at the whole arc of something, because I think that Indigenous writers are often sort of, you know, kind of always looking ahead as they are placing one publication there. The question of what they're after, I think it really differs and depends. And, you know, Pokagon's at the end of his life in the 1890s. Folks like Eastman and Bonin and like Carlos Montezuma and Pokagon are writing each other letters. So these are people who know each other. They're at the kind of beginning of their careers. And so I think we can see them at this moment as doing similar things, but then I think Eastman and Bonin go on to different kinds of careers, working with the Society of American Indians and this kind of early 20th century group of what are often called red progressives, so Indigenous peoples who are working with or against the government to try to better the conditions for Indigenous peoples. And Pokagon is a little bit of a different moment because he's older and at the end of his life in the 1890s. I hope that gets at what you're asking. Okay, thanks.
The next Zoom question comes from Elisa Beer. I wonder if, when teaching Indigenous bibliography, you've seen any patterns in how students respond. I suppose I'm most interested in whether students who have not been exposed to other forms of bibliography respond differently than those who have learned more about bibliography.
That's a great question. I get this. So the classes I teach are cross-listed with the English department, which is my home department, and our Native Studies minor at Northwestern. And so I often get a group of students where we don't have shared starting points. This is one of the things I really love about teaching those classes. We have to kind of find that starting point together. So I have folks who might have taken classes with my early modern studies colleagues and done history of the book work on Shakespeare or early modern cookbooks or what have you. And then I have students who've maybe taken Native Studies classes and have a kind of grounding in Native Studies theory and that field. And then I often have students from like econ or engineering who are taking this class because it's the one or two classes they have that aren't within their major. And they are coming out of a real sense of curiosity and openness, but don't have the training in literary studies or Native studies or history of the book. So I think we're often starting from a position of just like everybody's going to try to find the same page. And I guess so I don't know that I can really answer the question because I think I haven't had an experience like the one the person's describing. I'll just say, like, I think libraries and getting students in front of books is the best way to get everybody literally on the same page, because everybody has to start describing books really carefully and looking at what they see. And so I think the most success I've had is just to get people in front of a lot of Indigenous books really early and to start from there.
This is a speculative question, but as you were talking a little bit about the publication pattern of starting with children's books and periodicals and novels, could it be relevant, if you find this accurate, that a number of those writers stop writing? You know, so this is an avenue of using print and using publication of various kinds. And then a number of people, I would say that of Bonin and others, sort of make a conscious decision to stop pursuing that. Does that seem relevant to any of the questions you're raising?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. A kind of, and especially in conversation with Sean's question about kind of pursuing capitalist modes of production. It's interesting too to think about Eastman as somebody who like lectures and has a kind of public facing role, but isn't necessarily through writing at the end of his life. And I'm also thinking about, I mean, this is an earlier period, but somebody like Samson Occam, who like prints the bestseller or produces a bestseller, his sermon on the execution of Moses Paul, and then like does other work, but doesn't feel the need to go back and then continue to write. So yeah, I really appreciate that question. And I think, you know, if we were just to take Bonin, I think there's a real, not that she wasn't disenchanted before, but maybe a sense of like print can only take you so far. And there are other forms of activism or work that she just finds perhaps more compelling. Or that, that the kinds of activism that she's engaged in that period, you know, kind of, she gets frustrated with SAI, Society of American Indians. And so there's also a sense of like that collective, various people in that collective move on or move to different projects. So I guess I'm trying to think about like the social world at that time too, and it being print, but also these kind of activist collectives and what happens within those collectives and how that might contribute to folks not writing anymore. Were you thinking about anything in particular there?
Not in particular. I mean, is it Luther Standing Bear who actually leaves, you know, actually moves away?
Yeah.
Yeah, nothing in particular, just that it's kind of, it may show the way print, at least in a certain kind of settler world, carries all these things that we don't usually notice that carries. And then the decision to exit from that seems to me potentially to kind of illuminate things that we don't usually see as a constellation.
Yeah, that's great. I'm also, you're making me think about the fact that Standing Bear goes into film, and Zikala Shah, I think the opera is earlier, but you know, there's other kind of forms of performance and production. And so it'd be interesting to think about that kind of multimedia piece of things too, and how and if that fits into the story about print. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that question.
This Zoom question comes from Angie Calcetera. Although clearly it's a different genre, I'm wondering how your approach might offer a new way of thinking about Indigenous ledger art or ledger drawings in the late 19th century. Art historians have claimed that the scarcity of buffalo hides contributes to a shift to drawing and narrating on paper. And the buffalo, of course, were being made scarce by settler military incursions and white settlements, facilitated by deceptive treaties on papers, as reservations and armies brought paper ledgers with them. I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about this transition to paper in the historical context you're discussing as well.
Thank you for that question, Angie. You know, one of the things I think about with ledger art is how Indigenous people orient themselves to the page. And so one of the really interesting things I think we see there is there's not an assumption that there's a kind of left to right orientation to what happens on the page. And folks have done great work, and Angie's doing some of this work too, to think about how narrative and action and the rectangular shape of the page are kind of remade and repositioned by Indigenous peoples. And so I guess I think about that within the kind of larger political ecology of the page and the ways that Indigenous peoples are taking up wood pulp paper and the expectations of the page that come out of the history of the Codex in the West, but then also remaking it to align with their own needs and their own practices, and coming out of buffalo hides would be one of those things. And, you know, I think the question of scarcity is, I'll just say, I think you're absolutely right about the ways that, you know, in this case, we have a use of these settler forms. So like they're literally account books that are used to keep store keepers' accounts. And then in some cases, military target paper. So kind of remaking the paper tools of colonialism into surfaces for Indigenous ledger art, which often depict battles between Indigenous peoples and colonists. So I think that's slightly different from taking birchbark as a way to index deforestation, but I think those two stories are in conversation with each other, and they're certainly happening around the same time. So we can, I think, see them related in terms of these broader stories about how Indigenous peoples are using the political ecologies of the page.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's something in the floor.
Thanks again, Kelly, for a wonderful conversation here. Maybe this circles a little bit back to where the question started with Mitch, but and I do feel like you've got several narratives here, a new kind of literary history for us, but also this industrial history. And a word that came to me is, or if it's there at all, is our sustainability word. Is there any, do you hear or see anywhere in this debate with Pokagon maybe, but maybe the later generation too, about not just a resistance to, I mean, part of the problem with, you know, the Tribune is just the scale, right? The scale of destruction is like nothing else. And so is there ever a counter argument by any parties about different kinds of forestry practices, sustainability as an answer, and could that come from an Indigenous perspective?
I wish Sean was still here because he has worked on this and we talked about it. But there are, in the 19th century, when people start to realize that like the logging, the clear cutting of pine is going to cause problems, people start to think about what conservation looks like. So that's not maybe sustainability, but that's conservation. And so I think what we see at this moment is the kind of like, we have to strategically replant trees in order to sustain this. So that's not sustainability. That's like, let's ensure that industry can keep growing by just simply planting more trees. So I haven't found anything so far that would be that kind of counter voice. That said, this talk is like the newest piece of all this research, so very well may be there. And I just haven't gotten into the archives where that is. Yeah. We'll end on that.
We'll end on that
Somber
note.
note.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for an absolutely wonderful series. We really, really appreciate everything. So
Thank you all so much for the conversation.